Yes, sure.
Okay, let me begin. I'm sure that some of you here in the audience remember Professor Walzer. His first visit was connected to the 10th anniversary of Kritika when we were based in Nowy Świat, in the Brave New World Center. And Professor Walzer, as a symbol of the dissent then and from the beginning, the important point of reference for us when we established Krytyka Polityczna magazine, came with Marshall Berman and Michael Kazin as representatives of this magazine, invited for us to to have a really good gift for the 10th anniversary. And we had a nice travel around Poland. There was, I think, 11 debates in 7 cities, so in some centers and clubs of Krytyka Polityczna. So, I know that, and actually, each one of you wrote a nice piece after this trip, and like we have some actually good and bad experiences during this travel, if I remember correctly. But we have nice memories that we already discussed before. Actually, we discussed too many issues, so please forget all of them, because some of them I will ask you today. Yes, so, well, but for those who don't know, I'm sure no one like this exists on the earth, but just to make it more formal, let me remind you that Professor Walzer is was awarded a Professor Emeritus after he spent more than a decade, I think, or even more than 2 decades as a permanent, on the permanent position in Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Before Professor Walzer taught, I think, 25 years or more at Harvard. Your chair now is Michael Sandel has this chair.
Yes,
after you,
yes.
so it made this chair even more prestigious. And of course, we know Professor Walzer as a revitalizer of the just war theory, also as one of the founding fathers of communitarian communitarianism or communitarian position in the interesting debates in America, and also with it was pretty hot discussion even in Poland in 90s. And one of the most important contexts for our discussion about Polish constitution and the shape of Polish public sphere. So I remember as a student, I got texts of Professor Walzer on at least 2 or 3 classes. There are many other currents the most important book, Spectres of Justice, translated, of course, also to Polish, is this most important work as for communitarianism. But then I think 10 more books were translated to Polish. So one of them we had the honor to publish and to translate, Thick and Thin Morality, Thick and Thin Ethics. Actually, our title in Polish is not that nice, but the book is very interesting. And then the 2015 is your last book was published by Yale University Press, the Paradox of Liberation, and this is gonna be also the topic of a lecture of Professor Walzer, and this is gonna be the opening lecture for our academic season in the Institute for Advanced Study. And thank you, Professor, for coming here.
Thank you. So, thank you. Many years ago, I was told that whenever you talk about politics, you have to stand up. So I asked to be given an opportunity to stand up today. I wanted to understand and to write about the appearance of religious radicalism, religious fanaticism in the world today. I will call it the unexpected appearance. And that's a phrase I will use again and again in this talk. And since I am not, I don't do abstract theory, I needed some cases. And I picked some cases that I grew up with. And so I've been writing about India, Israel, and Algeria. Because in the years after World War II, in these three countries, three secular, leftish, national liberation movements, the Indian National Congress, the Labor Zionists, and the National Liberation Front, the FLN in Algeria, each of these succeeded in establishing an independent state and a secular state. And then roughly 25 to 30 years later, this state was challenged by a militant, politicized religious revival. Three different religions, three different countries, but the same time schedule. And so I'm asking what happened to national liberation. And in looking at these three cases, I'm not trying to discover some universal law. I'm just trying to learn what we can learn from these cases, which seem to me to be closely comparable cases. I'll defend that idea in a minute. And then we can apply, if there is anything to learn, we can apply what we learn from these cases to other cases. These are cases of democratic national liberation, in India and Israel, actually democratic. In Algeria, the FLN claimed to be democratic, and many of its militants were committed to democracy, and those militants found themselves in exile very soon after independence was won, but the formal commitment was to democracy. One could also study authoritarian secularization in Turkey or in Egypt or in Russia. And that the time schedule there is different, but there are also some similarities. And in these three countries, the religious revival is today a very powerful political force, and Hindu nationalists are in power today in India, moving cautiously so far, but with a clear determination to make India into something more like a Hindustan than a secular state. They haven't won a definitive victory over the Nehruvian secularists and liberals, but my what happened question is central to both academic and political debates in India today. In Algeria, after a brutal civil war in the 1990s, the radical Islamists have been repressed, but certainly not defeated. Many observers believe that if there were free elections, they would win again, as they did in 1991, and as similar groups would probably do across the Middle East. And in Israel, the messianic Zionists of the settler movement are an important part of Netanyahu's government, and so are the ultra-Orthodox Jews. These two groups, the messianic Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox, have different theological and political agendas, but they are equally opposed to the kind of state that David Ben-Gurion and the labor Zionists aimed to create. The aging militants of national liberation, the people in these three countries who are my age, were surprised by the religious revival, and I think we should share their surprise, even if we no longer believe, as they did, that history is on our side. They all accepted the academic theory of inevitable secularization, which was also a popular leftist theory in the 30s, 40s, 50s. All the liberationists in my three countries and in many others believed in it. So Nehru, in a book called The Discovery of India, published in 1935, wrote this Remarkable sentence. Some Hindus believe in a return to the Vedas. Some Muslims believe in an Islamic theocracy. These are idle fancies, for there is only one-way traffic in time. Ben Bella, the first president of the Algerian Republic, sat in a French prison for 5 years, reading Malraux and Sartre. He would never have thought of spending time with Muslim sermons or treatises. Ben-Gurion's famous agreement with the ultra-Orthodox, exempting their children from the draft, reflected a similar mindset. He thought they would be like the Mennonites or the Amish in the United States, a tiny, tiny sectarian group, which Israel would graciously tolerate and accommodate. The Jewish state would be ruled by free thinkers, which is Begin's own description, Ben-Gurion's description of himself. But along with this confidence in religion's eventual disappearance, the liberationist militants were also actively hostile to the existing religion of their people. The liberation they had in mind was twofold: from the foreign oppressor, the British, the French, and also from the oppression of the Hindu, Jewish, and Muslim religious traditions, and from the old religious authorities, the holy men, always men, the sages and scholars who had mostly accommodated the foreign rulers and who ruled themselves over the everyday life of their people. And I want to insist that this second liberation from religious authority was also supposed to be, in all my cases, a liberation of women. For women were, in each of these three religions, radically subordinated. Frantz Fanon, the leading FLN intellectual, provides the best example in a whole series of books and articles that he wrote in the 50s. The freedom of the Algerian people, he said, is now identified with woman's liberation, with her entry into history. And again, in the movement, the woman ceased to be a mere complement of the man. Indeed, it might be said that she pulled up her roots through her own exertions. In the Algerian case, the liberation of women didn't last very long or reach very high. The FLN had and still has its own glass ceiling. Still, women in the cities gained new opportunities and new freedoms. And this was true, much more true of women in India and Israel. In his novel, Old New Land, Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, described a society in which men and women would be fully equal and in which they would both be conscripted for national service, as in Israel today, though the equal status of women in the Israeli army is now challenged unexpectedly by the religious revival. Indeed, all three religious revivals are driven, in part at least, but I think in large part, by the fear of those self-uprooted, those liberated women who claim equality with men. Of course, there are women among the revivalists who don't want equality, women who apparently are comfortable with rigidly divided sex roles and even with subordination and exclusion from public life. Think of the many young women among ultra-Orthodox Jews or among radical Islamists. I'm not going to try to explain that. I'm not sure I know how to explain it. There are some easy explanations that I don't much like. A false consciousness, brainwashing. These are unsatisfactory because they absolve us of any need to come to grips with the appeal of extremist religion. In any case, I want to ask more generally, what happened to liberation, women's liberation, and everyone else's? Or perhaps better, what has happened to, what has gone wrong with the cultural reproduction of the secular left? And once when I was giving this talk and uttered that sentence, somebody shouted out from the audience, "You should focus on the physical reproduction of the secular left." But I won't go there tonight. Or again, how can we explain the persistence of the old religious culture? Actually, the religious zealots are something new, more modernist, more political, more ideological than anything in the three traditions. But they feed off of the persistence of, or the revival of, traditional piety, which was, after all, the piety of most Hindus, most Jews, especially the Jews from North Africa and Mesopotamia, and most Muslims. So, in a very important sense, the liberationists were at war with the people they wanted to liberate. And that's the paradox of liberation. I am a defender of the liberationist project, but I will also try, as you will see, to criticize some of its more radical versions. Before I begin there, let me insist again on the similarity of the three cases, though some early readers of my book have questioned this. In India, the comparison with Israel was readily accepted. The Indian National Congress and the old Labour Party are really very similar political formations. But the Indian intellectuals I talked to hated the comparison with Algeria. One of my Yale University Press readers wondered if the Zionist case was comparable to the others, given the years of exile and the conflict with the Palestinians. Actually, the Palestinians have gone through exactly the same process on almost the same timetable, though without achieving a state. A radically secular liberation movement has been challenged by a religious revival. So the far left, militantly secularist and Marxist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and also Fatah today, are challenged by Hamas. And Hamas, which I once thought represented the religious revival in a pretty extreme way, is now being challenged by jihadist Salafis allied with ISIS. So my question again, what happened to national liberation? What went wrong? And that question reflects my own sympathies, but it is a question a lot of people are asking. And clearly there are answers peculiar to each case. The religious revival in Israel would have taken a very different form without the Six-Day War of 1967 and its accompanying triumphalism, for then we would also be without the occupation and without the settler militants. Hindutva in India would probably be less powerful without the series of wars with Muslim Pakistan. But I want to focus here on causes internal to the liberation movements, causes directly related to the liberation struggles. I want to think about features of liberationist ideology that led to, I don't mean anything as strong as determined, but led to the fierceness of the religious response. And I think there are two factors that can help us understand what has happened, what is happening. And the two may seem inconsistent, but they actually stand together. First, the radicalism and absolutism of the secular militants, and second, the internal weaknesses of secular culture. The first of these is perhaps best illustrated by the idea of newness. Newness. The liberationists aimed literally to create, they all talked about this, a new Jew, a new Algerian, a new Indian. Ben-Gurion wrote that the Zionist pioneer was not a graft on the tree of tradition. He or she was a new tree. Or more explicitly, he wrote, the most important contribution that the labor Zionist movement has made is not the new ideology, but the creation of a new type of man. And Fanon wrote again and again about the creation of a new Algerian. The rejection of everything that was old was a feature of each of the movements I am looking at. According to the liberationists, the religious tradition, the old culture, made for weakness, passivity, fearfulness, and accommodation with foreign rulers. The stooped, frightened, exilic Jew was a Zionist stereotype, not only an anti-Semitic stereotype. Indian nationalists condemned the docility, the fearfulness of the conventional Hindu. Newness, by contrast, was identified with secular strength and vitality, with the pioneer, but also with the warrior. If you look at the iconography of the early Zionist movement or the iconography of the FLN, you will see the new Jew, the new Algerian, man and woman side by side, young, tall, muscular, handsome. So, and more than this, the liberationists believed that they would begin to create a new culture, an entirely new culture to go with the new men and women. Remember the effort of the French revolutionaries to create a new culture for Republican France, a new calendar, unfortunately organized on the decimal system with a 10-day week and only 1 day of rest, so it wasn't very popular, but a new calendar, new holidays, civic oaths full of reason, presided over by Robespierre, and much more. But it didn't take. Not in 1789 or 93, and not in 1848 either. The liberationists in India, Israel, and Algeria have done better, I think, with their new holidays, new heroes, new songs and dances, poetry, novels. All this worked pretty well for a generation or maybe 2 generations, and then it didn't work, or it didn't work well enough. It was very attractive, the culture of liberation, but it was at the same time a little thin, too thin, compared to the traditional religion. One example, which seems to me particularly important, the old religion marked the life cycle, providing occasions and ceremonies of celebration for birth, for coming of age, for marriage, and then rituals of mourning for people dealing with the death of loved ones. Secularists didn't do well with any of these occasions. Perhaps some of you have experienced, as I have, those awful, awkward moments at a secular funeral where nobody knows what to say or when to weep. My own conviction is that those of us sympathetic to Hindu, Jewish, or Muslim liberation have to find our way to an engagement. It would have to be a critical engagement with the historic culture, which is to say with the traditional religion, in an effort to create a thicker, more enduring liberalism or leftism, a culture that connects with, rather than merely negates, the old culture. Consider this example of the project. There is a wonderful organization, first established, I think, in Algeria, active now across North Africa and in India too, that's called Women Living Under Muslim Laws, WLUML. It's not a great acronym. This is an alliance of secular and religious Muslim women who search in religious texts for arguments against the gender hierarchy and find them. That is, they find texts that can be interpreted in an egalitarian way. They deny that there is a single Islamic tradition authoritatively interpreted by male scholars, hence the plural in their name, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, There's more than one way, they claim, of reading Sharia. And many of these women are learned enough to make their rereadings, to give their rereadings of these religious texts great scholarly force. Something similar has been going on in the Jewish world, with feminist scholars producing some wonderful new readings of biblical and Talmudic texts. And I've recently read a very excellent book by a woman named Uma Narayan called Dislocating Cultures, who argues for a similar effort among Hindu women. Maybe this sort of thing wouldn't have worked early on. Maybe the first liberationists had to be absolute in their rejection of religion. But I think that this engagement may be the best way of responding now to the religious zealots. So I don't mean to invoke the old dialectic. First you have the radical rejection of religion, then you have the radical reaffirmation of religion, and then you have the dialectical combination of the two. I don't think the dialectic has been working very well recently, but still the effort to engage the religious culture in a critical way seems to me the best way of responding now to the religious zealots. Now, I have to tell you that there is a Marxist critique of a project like mine, and also of the original liberationist project. Perry Anderson, the longtime editor of the English magazine New Left Review, writing a couple of years ago in the London Review of Books, claims that national liberation was a mistake from the beginning, and that the militants should not be surprised, have no right to be surprised at the strength of religious zealotry. Because the religious revival, he says, is a direct product of national liberation. His examples are very close to mine. He writes about India, Israel, and Ireland. He argues that national liberation is a contradiction in terms. Liberation can never be national. National liberation was never a leftist or liberating project, and it's the nationalism of the militants that invites the fierceness of the religious zealots. The two are really the same. They both depend on narrow chauvinist appeals to historical memories and tribal emotions, to blood and soil. What true liberation requires, on this view, is an internationalist movement transcending all boundaries, bringing all the oppressed peoples and all the subaltern groups together. Well, many of you will be familiar with arguments of this kind. I think that some, maybe many, liberal philosophers would make a very similar argument, though in a different idiom, that liberation can't be particularist in character, must be cosmopolitan and universalist, and that both nationalism and religion are too parochial to be liberating. Well, certainly there were blood and soil nationalists in each of these countries, and they are still a dangerous presence in power in India, in power partly in Israel. But the Marxist critique, I think, misrepresents the liberationist project, which was indeed meant to liberate a particular people, but which was also committed in each of my cases to the freedom of any minority groups that lived among the liberated people. The liberationist project was, from the beginning, at once particularist and universal. So consider these lines from a speech that David Ben-Gurion gave to his political party, the Labour Party, right after the passage of the UN's partition resolution in early December of 1947. This is Ben-Gurion, and I will quote at some length. "We must think in terms of a state, in terms of independence, in terms of full responsibility for ourselves and for others. In our state, there will be non-Jews as well, and all of them will be equal citizens, equal in everything without any exception. That is, the state will be their state as well. The attitude of the Jewish state to its Arab citizens will be an important factor, though not the only one, in building neighborly relations with the Arab states. The striving for a Jewish-Arab alliance requires us to fulfill several obligations, which we are obliged to do in any event: full and real equality, de jure and de facto, of all the state's citizens, gradual equalization of the economic, social, and cultural standard of living of the Arab community with the Jewish community, recognition of the Arabic language as the language of the Arab citizens in the administration, courts of justice, and above all in schools, municipal autonomy in villages and cities, and so on. That's Ben-Gurion in 47. He was certainly too optimistic about the possibility of a Jewish-Arab alliance, and maybe a little presumptuous in including culture in his talk of equalization. Nor did he and the governments he later led live up to the commitments he described here, and certainly the present government doesn't live up to them. Nonetheless, this was the language of a liberationist militant and also of a statesman, someone who understood, at least in principle, the political, legal, and moral responsibilities that would come with sovereignty. Prime Minister Nehru, in the first week of his administration, circulated a memorandum to all the members of his cabinet making essentially this same argument about the equality of Hindus and Muslims in the new India. Well, anyway, Marxist internationalism has not produced political movements, emancipatory movements anywhere in the world that can compete with national liberation. The authoritarianism of so many Marxist regimes derives in large part from the fact that they are forced to repress the nationalism as well as the liberty of the people they rule. So let me suggest that the unity of theory and practice, a central Marxist doctrine, requires us to conclude that given the failure of the practice, there must be something wrong with the theory. There is also a post-colonial critique of my project, which holds that both the secular state and the religious revival are similar creations of the colonial regime. But I have some difficulty here. I understand the jargon of the Marxists. I grew up with it, but I can't always grasp the arguments of the post-colonialists. The Indian economist Amartya Sen says that he reads them with a dictionary in his hand, and he still doesn't quite get it. Among post-colonial writers, the Indian social theorist Ashish Nandi, who's one of the people I met when I visited India years ago, Nandi is a much clearer writer than the others. He defends a pre-colonial Hinduism, which he says was fuzzy, pluralistic, pantheistic, anarchic, and generally incapable of sustaining anything like the zealotry of today's Hindutva militants. Nehruvian secularism and Hindutva militancy, Nandi argues, are both colonialist ideological productions imposed on ancient Indian culture by Indian imitators of the West. And so again, the elders of the Indian National Congress, like the old labor Zionists or the old FLN militants, shouldn't be surprised. The liberators were Westernizers who retained the structures of the imperial state and acted like imperial civil servants. And so they invite their religious opponents to challenge them for control of this state. But this is a fight between similars, between lookalikes who share the same modernism and the same political militancy. So this critique is obviously right in one sense. The influence of the West is powerfully felt in both camps, in the liberationist camp and among the religious revivalists. But the liberationists were Westernizers because they were leftists and because the left first emerged as a political and intellectual movement in the West. Nehru, who spent 8 years in English schools, was a Fabian socialist, never a communist, as Churchill once claimed. Nehru told the American ambassador in Delhi, John Kenneth Galbraith, that he was, quote, the last Englishman to rule in India. David Ben-Gurion and the labor Zionists generally were Central European social democrats. Chaim Weizmann, who taught for many years in Manchester, was an English liberal. Ben Bella and his friends were Francophile Marxists. They hated the French occupiers in Algeria, but they went to school with the French left. By contrast, the religious militants, insofar as they imitate the West, are more likely to follow the lead of far-right political movements committed to hierarchy, authority, and obedience. I guess that theirs, too, is a modernist project in some sense of that word, but I've said this again and again, not one expected by any of us who thought ourselves modern. So we should, I think, stand with the liberationists. And then we have to recognize that what they all needed to do, and sometimes tried to do, but ultimately didn't do, was to naturalize the values of the Western left, the European left, in the culture of their own people. That requires an engagement with the traditional culture, which was, in all my cases, a religious culture. Engagement doesn't mean surrender. It doesn't even necessarily mean compromise. And here I would ask you again to consider the work of Muslim women working to reinterpret Sharia law, or of Jewish women rereading the Bible and the Talmud and struggling to reinterpret Jewish law. These women are not looking for some moral legal position halfway between traditional subordination and radical feminism. They are looking for full equality, but they are looking in a place where the secular militants of early Zionism or of the FLN never thought to look. And they are doing this in order to connect with men and women who live in that place. Nor is this only a political, intellectual project. The ultimate success of liberation depends as much on poets as on philosophers. The revival of the Hebrew language has brought with it a remarkable literary renaissance in Israel, but not yet one that has much resonance among traditional or religious Jews. The major Indian novelists still write in English, more for a Western than an Indian audience. And many Algerian novelists, including the recent author of an Algerian response to Camus' The Stranger, write in French. We are still waiting for the men and women who can express the values of liberation in a language that moves not only the new Jews, the new Indians, and the new Algerians, but also the old ones. And that still seems to me a project worthy of our time, our energy, and our commitment. Thank you. So I prefer to keep standing, but yeah, why not? Sure.
And I have actually too many questions, and we have in the audience some interesting people. So
So I don't know if I should waste your time or transfer it immediately to okay, just to make your argument more clear to everybody, or at least to me. So what distinguishes the problem of, put it broadly, the left or leftist discourse project in these three countries, or in this common reality, than the general crisis of the left, or the general secularization, or the general, I don't know, like disenchantment, which happened everywhere actually. Well, you have left-wing rituals, habits everywhere in a crisis, with a bigger and bigger distance to it. May 1st, everywhere in the world is weaker year after year. So actually, what's the what is really different in what happens in Israel than what happens in, I don't know, Germany or whatever you take in Europe?
Well, I'm not sure whether there's something different. I thought that these three cases might be especially helpful because these were cases in which the secular left won the biggest possible victory. They established the state. And yet, still, they were challenged to 25 years later by this, not only by a decline of leftist commitment, but by a rise of religious zealotry of a sort that was radically unexpected by all of them and by everyone else on the left. I chose these cases, as I said, because I grew up with them. I was a kid when India and Israel won independence, but I was paying attention. And my first reading of the political argumentation was the arguments that went on the French left about what to do in Algeria in the late 50s and the early 60s. But I'm quite willing to say that there are other cases in which we might find similar phenomena and where comparisons might point up special features of this case or not. It's just that the accomplishment in these three cases was so remarkable. The creation of a state. There was Algeria had been ruled by France for over 100 years. It had not been a state in any modern sense before that. India had been many states. And ruled by England for a very long time, well over 100 years. The Jews had lived in exile for almost 2,000 years, stateless. The Zionist creation of a state was perhaps the most remarkable of achievements. And now when you talk to the founders, the people who are of the founding generation, they think their state has been taken away from them within their own lifetime. So it seemed to me important to ask, how did this happen? Now, maybe there are other cases that are not different. I mean, I did say that the general anxiety that animates the project is what has gone wrong with the cultural reproduction of the secular left. And I think you are engaged in an effort to reverse that decline. My wish is that you succeed.
Well, we'll see. Okay, so but to challenge it again, to make your argument more clear on the other side, and to distinguish this phenomenon that you are describing from the general revenge of God, as Gilles Capel, also analyzing the situation in Israel, called it, and the general awake of religious, I wouldn't say zealotry, but like, and fanatism only, but generally religious engagement everywhere, beginning in the United States, ending, I don't know, even in Russia. That was the example of successful authoritarian secularization, as you mentioned it already. So again, what is here different in those national liberations that you're talking about?
Well, these are just very clear cases that what has happened around the world is a revival of traditional piety, but there is also the appearance of these militant, ideological, political zealots. I think zealots is the right word, who feed off of the revival of tradition. It's not; they're not the same. The messianic Zionists of the settler movement in Israel are not traditional religious Jews. Traditional religious Jews were politically passive, waiting for the Messiah to come. And this is a different kind of religious movement. We haven't seen anything quite like it in the United States. There is a revival. There is a revival of evangelical Protestantism, and in some parts of the Catholic world, a revival, though perhaps because of recent popes, it isn't zealotry, and it doesn't aim at overthrowing the secular state. But there isn't yet a Christian movement that is like the Islamist movements, or like the Messianic Zionists, or like the Hindutva. I don't think there is a movement like that anywhere in the Christian world. So I picked three cases in which you have a very extreme version of religious revival, and one that, as I keep saying, totally unanticipated. I don't know, when I went to graduate school and studied political science, everyone believed in modernization, the triumph of science and reason, the slow but inevitable erosion of religious belief. That those were taken as presumptions of all further research. You began by believing that that's what was going to happen, and then you had to argue about whether it would happen slowly or quickly in this part of the world or that part of the world. But everyone agreed. So this is something that requires requires serious efforts at explanation. And for those of us who are politically engaged, it requires a response. How do you respond to this kind of, how do you compete with the religious zealots for the hearts and minds of ordinary Hindus, ordinary Jews, ordinary Muslims? Because you have to do that. If you're living in India, Israel, or any place now in the Muslim world.
And the third last context, but maybe not my last question, I'm sorry, is what this national component. Actually, I cannot imagine even one successful example of non-national liberalization. And Ukraine is now a very good example that what they really need is a nation, and even nationalism, as Anna Applebaum are claimed, and I fully agree with this. But maybe the crisis of a nation states is the base or the background or the main reason of the crisis also of liberal left. How you can imagine liberal left or or socialist left outside of the state, or social democracy, outside of democracy, actually, and you don't have it anywhere else than in a national state.
Right, right. And some of the left-wing opponents of the EU have been arguing for the last several decades that the nation state has provided the only space, the only political space within which the left has had, the socialist, social democratic left, has had victories. There is no other space in which we have been able to win. So the challenge to the nation state, which comes of modern Islamist radicalism, is not state-based. It's not nationalist. It is universalist. Some of the radical Islamists write explicitly about, well, first you have to reconquer the lands which were once Muslim, like Spain. Spain is first on the list, and then the whole world. And they are quite explicit about this. This is a universalist movement. And so those of us who are still trying to operate within the state have got to figure out how to respond to that. And if socialism had its own version of internationalism, but it really was what socialist internationalism meant in practice was the support of national parties, of socialist parties in one country for socialist parties in other countries, with the idea that there should be many states in the hands of their own people, of the working people. And that's still, for me, that is still a vision. I have never been attracted by those political scientists who talk about the end of the nation state, the post-Westphalian world, the inevitable globalization of. I don't think that is the way we should be thinking, because the greatest human misery in the world today is caused by the breakdown of states, the failure of states, the civil wars within states, or the absence of a state, as in the case of the Kurds or the Palestinians. What everyone in the world most needs is a decent, functioning state. And I still think that people on the left should be engaged in not the transcendence of the state system, but the completion of the state system. Because right now, there is no political formation, there is no political agency capable of providing physical security and welfare and education and economic management, except the state. So we should be statists. We should be statists, not forever. There will be other political formations. There will be possibilities for turning the boundaries of the state into dotted lines, a cooperation across boundaries of many different sorts, forms of union or confederation, maybe not union, but confederation among states. There will be other political formations that will be compatible with the egalitarian commitments of the left. But right now, I think we have to think that the project of the people I'm talking about here, to create an independent state for their own people, ruled by their own people, that project is still our project.
Actually, this is strong. Your argument is also confirmed very strongly and broadly by the last and previous book of Tim Snyder. That the destruction of the state can be not only the main reason for the catastrophe, but was the main context for the Holocaust. Holocaust happened on a Holocaust scale mostly or in 95% in the area where the states were destructed, sometimes twice or three times when there was like a Soviet and Nazi invasion, like here, for example. But like my last question would be about your, is a very open one, about your anticipation. What's gonna happen with this religious awakening? Because if we treat literature as a seismograph, and you look at the last novels of our common friend Amos Oz or Judas, actually the book is very, it's not maybe, it's actually, it's based on the story that happened in the late 50s. So when still, or when there was like a crisis of this, of this, uh, of this obvious answers to those big questions. But book of Michel Houellebecq is another one that is discussing the problem with the religion, to put it in the most simple way. But actually, religion is almost everywhere in literature. The monumental book written here, the most important novel in the last years, which is Jacob, how to call it, Stories, by Olga Tokarczuk, the leading Polish author, is about Frankism, Hasidism, and all, and this like mysticism and the world of mystics. So what do you think that it indicates? It shows what kind of symptoms are here, uh, um, or like what's your, you're a politologist and political commentator, so what would be your anticipation about it?
Yes. Well, as a secular Jew, I'm not a prophet. I have recently been reading, reading many different things about religion that I hadn't read before, including stories, histories of the Christian Crusades. This was a previous example of jihadi. It's like, it is the Christian version of jihadi zealotry, and the crusading fervor was a very important part of Christendom for some 200 years. Now, you understand that most Christians in Europe in the 12th century, 11th century, listened to sermons urging them to march to Jerusalem, and they went home. The actual participants in crusading warfare are always a minority. But with sufficient zealotry, a minority can be very, very frightening and destructive. And this did go on for some time, but it had opponents. I've recently come from a conference here in Warsaw celebrating the work of Paul Władimir, who is in Polish, who in 600 years ago, in 1415, wrote a treatise, delivered it to the Council of Constance, opposing holy war, opposing crusading warfare. He had a particular group of crusading warriors in mind, namely the Teutonic Knights, who were fighting against pagan tribes in the name of God in what is now Lithuania and Belarus. And he argued that infidels had exactly the same right to dominion, to sovereign power, as Christians did. And it is an extraordinary argument.
It's Polish. This is why he's completely unknown.
It is an extraordinary argument, and perhaps at the time a brave one, for the Teutonic Knights had powerful allies at the Council of Constance. And I argued in my lecture at this conference that the arguments that he made against Christian holy war apply almost to the letter. against jihadi versions of the same thing, and that this is an intellectual project in which we have to be engaged, maybe for a long time. The struggle against in some countries like India, the struggle against Hindutva nationalism can be mostly, maybe entirely, a political and intellectual struggle. It is, I think the Hindutva nationalists are prepared to relinquish office if they lose an election. I don't know whether that's a permanent commitment, but right now they seem committed to do that. And certainly the religious zealots in Israel can lose an election and lose power. In much of the Muslim world, the fight against Islamic zealotry will sometimes be a military fight, and sometimes it will be police work, but all the time it will require intellectual work. And we should be doing that work, I think, and I think that is a long-term commitment. This is not a phenomenon that is going to go away soon. There are Muslim versions of Paul Vladimiri. There are Islamic theologians and lawyers who are making arguments like the ones he made against the jihadi warriors. We need to find them, we need to support them, but we need to carry on our own intellectual battle against religious zealotry. We need to make the arguments, the old Enlightenment arguments, and we need to make them better than we've been making them in the recent past.
I promise to pass the mic to Agata Bielik first, and then I see two hands.
Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture. I enjoyed it immensely. And at the end, you expressed your hope that here in Poland, we are in the process of reverting the tendency of the dying out of the secular left. But I'm sorry to disappoint you. This society is not treading in the footsteps of Peter Vladimiri. And in about 10 days, it's going to be a general election. And with all probability, we're going to have a change of government and we're going to establish a Catholic theocracy in Poland. So basically, everything you said about the dynamics of the liberation movements in Israel, in Algeria, in India, applies very well to the Polish situation too. And
We're moving from Catholic democracy to Catholic theocracy.
Absolutely, yes. I kept translating everything you said about the national liberation movements in those three cases to the Polish case, and it fits to the T. It fits perfectly, which means that in '89 we have a liberation generation, we could say a desert generation, that is, just as you said, very much insisting on creating a new pole that is away from everything that was linked or associated with the so-called Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet man, but also with the tradition and the church, the Catholic Church, that used to go hand in hand with the communist rule that is adopted to the communist conditions. So basically, it was a very much like an accent on the newness, a revolutionary change, and exactly 25 years later, there is a backlash of everything old, that it's just coming back after the desert generation is gone, and we are back with the situation of the Catholic fundamentalism, which is not exactly just the return of the old. It's like a combination of exactly everything you said too about fundamentalism, what Gilles Capel also confirms. It's that is actually a backlash to the West against the modernization. It is more like a reaction against the liberation generation, against all the attempts to create something new. So I'm not very optimistic about the Polish situation. So basically, that this is just what I said. And also, you see, what this liberation people did, right? This generation did, in a way, they were already applying your recipe. You said that with this insistence of the newness, there also should be like the attempt to naturalize the teachings or the elements of Western enlightenment within local traditions. They tried to do so. They tried to work on the Catholic tradition. There was the whole tradition of the open church they wanted to cultivate. They were journals and newspapers devoted to it, and it still did not help. Which means that the backlash of the old, the fundamentalist version of Catholicism, somehow combined with the returning Homo Sovieticus, in the end, 25 years later, had to replace them. Okay, so this is just an observation, but I also have a question. Okay, this is just an observation. I don't know how much you know about the situation of Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, but I just wanted to thank you for actually delivering a perfect diagnosis of what's been happening here for the last 30 years. But I also have a question, because I also believe, just like you, that we can't just insist on the newness or a simple import of the abstract enlightenmental values. We definitely need to naturalize them within the local traditions. But don't you think that there are certain differences, right? You wrote a beautiful book on Exodus. That is how the Jewish tradition, when read with the special angle, can actually support naturally all the paradigms of revolution and reformist social changes, right? You mention these women reading Sharia laws away from the patriarchal interpretation. But do you think that all Abrahamic religions have exactly the same emancipatory potential? Or, going even further, also Hindu religions, also the so-called non-Abrahamic pagan religions, can the enlightenmental values be entrenched in the new interpretation of all of them?
All of them.
Not all of them, but at least, like a significant numbers of them, right?
Well, the religious traditions that I'm familiar with are very rich and encompass not only different texts and different histories of interpretation, but also contradictory ones. So I think the answer is yes, that in any rich religious or civilizational culture, there are opportunities for interpretations that are consistent with humanist, liberal, enlightenment, leftist values. I think that is very important. In writing my book about the Exodus, I read many Christian texts using this biblical text in Florence in the 15th century, in England in the 17th century. The Puritans actually thought that they were reenacting the Exodus with King Charles as Pharaoh. And then among the liberation theologians of Latin America, who wrote again and again interpretations of the Exodus story as an emancipatory story. So yes, I think that there is. I suppose I could say it in an even more radical way, which will sound postmodernist, which I am not. you can say almost anything in any of the given intellectual languages of humanity. You can be, as Paul Vladimiri was, a schoolman and a liberal, for his texts are models of liberalism. You can be, I've recently had some engagement with Neo-Confucianism in China. You can be a liberal, a leftist, an authoritarian, and a communist Confucian. It all works in some odd way. But as I said, the engagement has to be, it has to be a full-scale engagement, and it has to include poets and novelists as well as political theorists. It can't just be us.
You basically think it's a decision, because that the texts themselves are so rich that basically almost beyond coherence, right? So
I didn't hear it.
no, you said that it has to be a decision, right?
Well, yes, it has to be a commitment. It has to be an active engagement with this culture. Look, I have been engaged, in addition to the little book on Exodus, I have been engaged for 25 years now in editing a series of volumes called The Jewish Political Tradition. There will be 4 volumes, 2 of them have been published. These are texts accompanied by commentaries by contemporary political theorists and lawyers and philosophers. And the effort is to deny that the tradition belongs to Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. This is an effort to present the tradition in a version which is accessible to liberal and secular Jews and non-Jews. Because it's an interesting tradition. This is, if you're interested in non-state formations, the Jews have been working at that were working at that for 2,000 years. But this is 20 years in the making, and we've only published 2 of the 4 projected volumes. The project has to be a long-term project, and there will be temporary, I hope, temporary defeats, but there will also be victories. You have to believe that.
Here was a question, then here, and then here. Tu dla pana tutaj, z Austrii, jeśli dobrze pamiętam.
Take that.
Thank you. I have to stand when you are standing. It's not possible to sit. Mr. Walzer, I have a question. All these leaders of the national liberation, Lumumba, Pol Pot, all of them nearly, Bella, they were intellectuals. Their concepts have been intellectuals. And I think once the people got rid of the foreign oppressor, so what you say was new, was strange, was foreign. Because there was a class differentiation between these leaders, these intellectuals, and the people. And I think this was a gap which opened later on. This is one point. The second is that, don't you think that what we see is a breakdown of the functioning of a social liberal concept, which we have in Europe, which doesn't work in those countries? Ben Gurion was a social democrat. Ben Bella, I don't know, but Nehru was a social democrat, I think. These concepts failed, and now what we see is that in the Muslim Brotherhood, in Hamas, in Iran, these extremely conservative movements have inbuilt a social narrative, a social organization. Even ISIS has one. Mm-hmm. ISIS outside is very brutal, but inside they try to build up a health system, an education system. No one talks about it because we don't like the ideas that they have something positive. But I think it is important to see it. Mm-hmm. And the last one, sorry, is we have I'm Austrian, and we have in Germany this notion, this word of Heimat, which was very much misused by the Nazi regime. But I think this Heimat, what I don't think we can name it homeland, feeling of home. I think, and in all those countries, the Front National here in Poland to in Austria, the left has no concept to substitute anything and to bring it against its Heimat feeling. People, it seems to me now, I have to commit that in all the days I wouldn't have said that people have the need of feeling at home. And they do not feel at home. And the Front National is a response of not feeling at home. And the left has no answer whatever, because communist internationalism and the EU project is not an answer to this lack of this feeling. Thank you very much.
Yes, well, I think you are describing the problem. And first of all, it isn't, the left often acts as if it isn't part of the nation. But the national history of all the countries that we are engaged in today, we are part of the national history. And it is a big mistake. After 9/11, many Americans put flags in their front yards, or hung a flag out of the window. And Michael Kazin, one of the editors of Dissent, wrote an article saying, of course, that's the right response to 9/11, and we should not be making fun of these people. We should be doing what they are doing. I think leftists often get it wrong, but it's not an inherent part of leftism to get it wrong. I don't think so. I don't think so. Many of us are at home in the countries in which we live, and when we argue for a certain kind to make our country a certain kind of country, we are arguing on Heimat grounds. We are. That's why else are we interested in changing this country rather than some other country? And we have to find a way of expressing the loyalties that most of us feel. I was very active in the campaign against the Vietnam War, and internal to that campaign was the very fight that you are describing, because there were militants in the anti-war movement who wanted to carry Viet Cong flags in our demonstrations and to spell America with a K on our posters. And some of us said, no, that's not the way to win a political campaign in America, and it doesn't express the way we feel about America. We oppose this war because we think it isn't consistent with the values of our country, and that's the argument that we have to make again and again and again. So I don't think the people who carried Viet Cong flags were expressing the essence of leftism. I think that was a form of anger, of militancy that we should oppose, always oppose.
Hi. What I wanted to know is how good or bad were many of these secular forces at actually governing, for instance, in Israel? Because I only know the Indian case quite well, and the Congress was a mess for a lot of during many of the instances it governed. it was rife with nepotism at some point. The descendants or the successors of Nehru veered towards autocracy under Indira Gandhi, and the last few years it's seen as tone deaf, out of touch, and purely clientelistic. And what you had is that, for instance, some of the counter movements, which are part of the Hindutva movement, such as the Shiv Sena, were actually pretty, let's say, successful at organizing laborers around Bombay, for instance, within the slums. So, it was also a socioeconomic movement, and Hindutva actually has a lot of countervailing forces. I would say the Aam Aadmi Party has now swept the Delhi Parliament, which is not at all a Hindutva party, and they defeated the Hindutva candidates in and around Delhi with a more populist platform, just get rid of corruption and stand up for the common man. Yeah. So, I mean, how much weight should we put on the thesis that says we lost the argument because we haven't really grabbed the minds and hearts of people with our secularist message? Whereas a lot of people also just say, well, the Congress, I was willing to vote for them, but they screwed up, honestly. And I don't know whether that's also playing in Israel or well, the Algerian case is specific maybe, but...
Well, yes, I wanted to stress what I call the internal relations of the liberation militants with the people they aim to liberate. But there are other stories to tell, a little different in each case, but again with some similarities. Each of the liberation movements produced a political party, which was for the first decades of the new state, the ruling party. And as happens with any party that rules for a long time, there was corruption. The second generation of Congress leaders, of Labor Party leaders, of FLN leaders were not the idealists of the earlier, like the older leaders. And the religious zealots are also righteous. So when they oppose corruption, it is with that they often do so in an effective way. In power, they're not so righteous. There is corruption of extensive corruption in the Iranian rule of the Ayatollah, but yes, that is one part of the story, and the bureaucratic version of social democracy that was established in India and Israel, partly in the Algerian economy was more modeled on East Europe than on West Europe, although Ben Bella's Ben Bella ruled only for 2 years. His political advisors were French Marxists. But in India and Israel, social democracy was at first quite successful. In Israel, the ingathering of refugees from Europe and from North Africa was basically successful. The economy, they managed to bring 1 million people very quickly into a country that was not prepared for it, and it was not a wealthy country. But as we have seen again and again, a social democratic bureaucracy tends to get hardened, sclerotic, and very inefficient after some period of time. And that also, the Hindutva militants are also neoliberal. They espouse the global version of capitalism, and that's also true with some of the Israeli right-wing religious Zionists, not all of them. So yes, it's a big story. You have to tell the whole story, and I wasn't doing that today. But for people who are magazine editors or political intellectuals, we have to address the ideological issues.
Okay, so these two last questions, okay? Well, okay, will you agree to be the last one? So-
I have a very short one. It's a follow-up from the observation from the Polish person who said strongly, you said there is the zealots are not, you don't see them in the Christian world right at this moment. She said they're coming into power in a few weeks here in this country. What's your response to that? I'm just curious.
Well, I'm I sometimes when you visit a foreign country, you have to listen and not just talk. So I was listening, and I hope that that the result of the election here, the coming election here, if it is a victory for the right, is not a permanent. It's not the end of the story. In democratic governments, we believe in the right of the opposition to oppose, and it is a part of the ideology of democracy that the opposition always has a chance of coming to power in the next election. No,
Actually, there is also a question, are we talking about fanatics or cynics? Because it's really like, the guy who is the leader of it said 20 years ago about the most, Catholic party here, that the way to de-Christianization of Poland goes through this party. So like the opponents, the political opponents, they had almost every ideas already in their agenda. Of course, the people who support them probably are very religiously engaged, but not necessarily the leaders, and it may make difference. But actually, I don't believe that Professor Walzer is not a prophet, but at least not for the Polish case. Okay, so let's have a last question.
Okay. Well, I am obviously interested in the future, not just the past, and I see these liberation movements as an extreme version of what happens when the secular left loses contact with the basic needs and rights of people. So my question is really, do you think that the problem of the left is it has not in any way been able to appear to what is basically the deep-seated religious needs of many, many people? That is the need for security, the need for a sense of identity. My colleague mentioned the use of the word Heimat, and that has been the problem with the left. That has been the problem with the left here. They have consistently opposed and attacked the religious institution of the country. Now, I've got no objection to that because I'm not a Catholic and I don't particularly care. But what I would say is that they have, by doing that, they have actually said to many, many people in our societies, and they did in the countries that you are referring to, that we know how you should live, that you may have your stupid little Sunday services or whatever it is, but they are not important. And that what we have to do is to go back as the left, and I'm a member of the Labour Party for around about 40 years, and I'm a socialist and proud of it, that in fact we have to go back to start going to a more deeper seated sense of what people really are and what they want to live. And that goes obviously, of course, back to Heimat. But I'm also now going to do an advert for my own party, the British Labour Party. We did have a revolution at the end of the 19th century. That revolution was actually fueled.
If it's not the hidden knowledge, then use the mic.
That it? Oh, sorry, I thought it had gone. Technology, you see.
Which Labour Party?
British Labour Party. But the end of the 19th century, we had and if you actually look at the people who created that Labour Party, Keir Hardie, Cardinal Newman, many, many people, they actually were driven by a religious view and a religious obligation. So what I'm suggesting is that the failure that we are seeing is essentially one that is due to the fact the left forgot ordinary people and forgot their religious values, and they need to go back to it.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that, but there are also religious values that the left has to oppose, and that is crucially the story of the emancipation of women. Because there, although it is important for women to look for sources in the tradition to support their own emancipation, there are practices of the Jewish religion, the Hindu and Muslim religions, I won't talk about Christianity, that need to be simply confronted and opposed. So you can work within a tradition, but sometimes you will have to fight. But the left does learn. After 1 million Russian Jews came to Israel, the Labor Party stopped singing the Internationale at its party conferences.
And I think 6 years of Soviet communism will bring you the proper perspective, you know, so. I congratulate you and your geography.
Okay.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Professor Walzer. It was great. I asked Professor Walzer about this article on Paweł Włodkowicz. It's not going to be published in Krytyka, but it's going to be published and available by the Catholic University in Warsaw. So I'm eager to read it, and I'm sure that you as well. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.